Hello, I'm K. A. Crisco, the author of the Stolen Science Fantasy Trilogy. Today, I'm going to read you the first chapter of the first book, Stolen. You can find my books on Amazon.com or by visiting my websites at kacrisco.com. Now, let's get started. Stolen, Chapter 1. In the northern woodland there lived a grove of Lephala. At night, when they wished to move around, the Lephala, who in the day resembled the trees of the forest in which they grew, would stir and shake themselves, and leaves and small branches would shower to the ground. The twigs and leaves assembled themselves into a form, sometimes four-legged like the creatures of the forest, but as often two-legged, with waving, leafy arms and wild hair of twigs and buds. Then they ran swiftly about, fading in and out of the woodland. When dawn came, the leaf people returned to their trunks. But sometimes, even in daylight, amber eyes could be seen from deep within the cracks in the bark. Among them there was one who was different in form, and he was called Stolen. Stolen was small and lithe, with his leaves layered neatly upon his brow, and he went about in daylight as well as at night. Only when he thirsted did he send forth root-shoots into the soil, and only when he hungered did he stop and throw his arms wide to the strong sun. He was young, and he traveled widely throughout his woodland while his people rested during the day. One evening he came to the very southern edge of the woodland, and peering out of the shadow he saw a human village in a clearing. Curious, he darted from trunk to trunk and observed the strange creatures as they moved from hut to hut. The small ones laughed and shouted, and their language sounded harsh and strange to him. His own language was soft and whispered, barely heard, like the rustle of leaves in a breeze. One child wandered close to the border of trees. Stolen stilled himself, willed his leaves to blend with those of the saplings and brush, and watched. It was a young girl, although Stolen did not understand age or gender. She was lithe and supple, and her long dark hair flowed in the gentle breeze and fell about her face. She came closer and suddenly looked up, directly where Stolen stood. She stopped short and cocked her head like a fox. Stolen looked into her eyes, and knew she could not distinguish him from the forest land, but he also knew knew something was there. He felt something strange stirring inside him. A voice called from the village, and the girl turned and ran swiftly without glancing back. After a while, Stolen dared to move, and faded back into the trees softly and slowly. When he was well away from the village, he ran swiftly and silently back to the grove of the Lephala. From then on, he returned often to the village, and he looked always for the girl, and he saw her glance towards the woods with that same expression of curiosity he had seen the first day. Sometimes she wandered near him, and he could smell her and hear her footfalls in the grass and brush. But always someone from the village called her back. Stolen began to look at himself and at the Lephala, and compare himself to them. It seemed to him that he was different, although he had never thought deeply about it before. "Mother," he said to the Lephala who raised him, "why am I different?" "You are young," she answered, "and you will grow. When you are older and larger you will put down roots." She shook herself, but did not let her leaves fall. She remained in her trunk, as she was wont to do. "But there are no others like me," persisted Stolen. "My limbs are short and solid compared to yours, and I run about entire without dropping my leaves and branches to make my body. You and the rest of the Lephala all prefer to stand and drink the water from the soil and eat the light of the sun. You go about only when it is necessary, and it tires you. I prefer to go about and only root when necessary. It is not the same." His mother hesitated. "The Lephala have been here on this earth for many hundreds of thousands of years," she whispered. "It is in our nature to grow staid over time. Every once in a while one arrives who is more motile, and the blood of this one serves to reinvigorate our line, so that we do not grow more and more rooted each generation. You are only different because you are such a one, looked for and treasured, my son, because of what you will bring to the Lephala." Stolen went away, but he brooded over her words. Still he was drawn to the human village, spending more and more time lurking around the edge of the clearing until he learned to distinguish their words, one from another. Although he could not understand them, he grew to know their cadence. He looked for the girl and compared her to the others, and she seemed preferable to him. His desire to have her know him and see him became stronger and stronger. One day he saw a strange event. A woman returned to her home with several fruits from the community garden. She placed the fruit on a bench outside her house and went to fetch water from inside. She left her young son, a baby only a few months old, slumbering in the shade. Stolen saw an older child come around the house. The child saw the sweet fruits and stopped. He glanced around, then snatched 2 of the fruits and ran. Shortly the woman returned with her water. She immediately saw that 2 of the fruits were missing. She put down her water, snatched up her son, and began screaming with rage. Her husband ran to her from nearby. Stolen sank back a little more into the forest, but not so far that he could not hear. The woman stamped her foot while her husband tried to calm her. She pointed at the remainder of her harvest and shouted over the cries of her awakened baby. And then he heard it. "Stolen! Stolen!" the woman screamed. Stolen felt the shock go through him. At last a human word he could understand. But it was his own name, or at least that which he was called, for the Lephila have no common names. He turned and ran back through the forest, mindless of whether he was seen. Deep in the cool and dark he sank down to think. He looked down at his own limbs, at the leaves that covered him from head to foot like scales. Then he rose and sped back towards the grove of the Lephila and the trunk of his mother, mindless of the fact that she was sleeping. "Stolen! Stolen!" he shouted, striking the shell of her bark, awakening her. "Yes, stolen," she agreed sleepily, stirring her leaves. "Stolen! I am stolen! You took me! You took me without consent! You stole me, took me away from my own people!" "Yes," the Lephila said hesitantly, "you are stolen, and that is what we call you. But you were taken when you were a very small baby, so you would not remember your life before us. We take only babies, and only when we must." Stolen threw his limbs about in anger. "But why did you do this thing? Where do I come from? What am I, if not Lephila? What am I to become?" "Shh, my son," the Lephila soothed, but Stolen stamped in rage. "I am no more your son than the stones of the mountains or the foxes of the forest." "You are more my son than the son of any other," she said. "The Lephila must infuse the blood of other creatures from time to time, or we grow rooted and lose our ability to go about. I have told you this before. You were taken from humans, yes, but you were raised Lephila. You were fed on sunlight, and you drank deep from water trapped in the soil. You have become Lephila, and there is nothing else you can ever be. So it has been since our race began. But you are free to go about at any time you want, and you will be free to choose when the time comes. You will pollinate whichever Lephila you desire." Stolen crossed his limbs and turned away. "I will not pollinate. That is not what humans do, or other creatures of the forest." This he knew well, for he had seen much during his travels through the woods. "But you will," his mother said. "We have raised you. We have made you Lephila. You are necessary to the future of our people, and I have sacrificed much to bring you to what you are today. What if I do not want to be Lephila? What choice have I had in all this? What if I wish to return to a human village?" His mother sighed deeply, and a breath of air passed through her leaves like a spring breeze. "You cannot return to a human village. You do not look like them. You have grown leaves, and your hair is twigs and buds like ours. They would be frightened of you. They would not accept you. The changes we have wrought over time are deep and permanent. You can never be like them again." Stolen's anger was spent, and he went to sit by the brook. It was true that he took his food from the sun, and did not know how to take sustenance as the people of the village did. But he was sure the girl in the village would not be frightened of him. She would accept him, he was certain. She would take him into the village, would teach him their ways. But even as he imagined it, he knew in reality that the people of the village would not accept him. His mother spoke the truth. The only way for him to be with the girl would be for the two of them to go away together, to a place where they could be alone, Lephila and human. Stolen rose and made his way back to the village. It had grown dark, and wispy clouds crossed the face of the half-moon. But his dark eyes beneath the leaves of his brow burned with an amber light, and he saw easily in the shade of the forest. He moved swiftly to the edge of the clearing, and there he crouched by the bushes and watched as the village lights went down, and the noise of people chattering and laughing sank away to silence. He went carefully toward the house where he knew the girl slept. He did not disturb the village dogs, for they, like the forest creatures, have always been aware of the Lefala and are not concerned by them. It was warm, and the door had been left open, only a screen hanging there to keep out the night insects. He pulled it aside and slipped inside. Quickly he located the girl, sleeping under a light covering. He scooped her up in his leafy limbs without awakening her. She was light enough for him to have no trouble bearing her away to the forest. Only when he had traveled several hundred yards and entered the woods did she begin to stir. He set her down and knelt next to her, waiting for her to open her eyes and gaze upon him. Within a few seconds of opening her eyes, the girl's mind seemed to clear, and she understood that she was out of her house and in the woods. He imagined her seeing the silhouette of the sapling near her, moving and bending, rustling without the wind. When she saw his eyes, dark as the night sky, her own eyes widened slightly in recognition. She shrank back. Stolen saw the look of terror and horror on her face. It would take a while, he told himself, but soon she would see he meant her no harm. Quickly he scooped her up again and ran through the forest, strong and swift as he had ever been, a great beating pulse inside of him such as he had never felt before. When he came to the grove, he set the girl down in front of the Lefala. "Mother," he cried triumphantly, "see what I have brought! I have stolen myself a human companion, and it is with her I will dwell. There will be no pollination for me." His mother stirred herself and looked down upon him. "What have you done?" she cried, her voice like 1,000 twigs rubbing together. "You cannot take a human being whenever you wish." "You took me," Stolen said. "That was different. It was necessary and rare, and you were an infant, endangered by your own kind. A Lefala cannot take a human wife. She has been raised in a human village, and that is what she knows and understands. She cannot become Lefala, and you cannot re-become human. They will look for her in the morning. You must return her at once." "I will not return her," Stolen said. "I will go far from here where they cannot find me, and she will grow to know and understand me. The other creatures of the forest know us and are not afraid. She is an animal like them." "It will not work that way," his mother said. "She will not learn to love or understand you. She is human, and humans are not like the other creatures of the forest. They have lost what knowledge they ever had of us. It is not a thing you can change." "But give me some time, Mother," Stolen begged. "We will stay here for a few short days, and if she does not come to love me, I will take her back, I promise." "No," his mother said, her voice hollow and low like the wind deep in a cave. "There is no time to be had. Her people will come when they find her missing. They will bring dogs to track her, and they will come swiftly with fire. If they find her here, they will wreak havoc on this grove, and on the forest animals they will blame. We cannot allow it." "Mother, you stole me," Stolen reasoned. "It was not my choice. I have become Lefala. Perhaps I cannot change, as you say, but give me at least this chance. You owe it to me." His mother bent toward the other Lefala, and they whispered and sighed amongst themselves. Stolen could not understand them, but it seemed some argument was ensuing, and the words came fast, crackling like dry leaves underfoot. After several minutes, his mother bent toward him, and the terrified girl crouched on the ground. "You cannot stay here," she whispered, and her breath stirred the girl's hair. "But there is a place you can go. You must follow my directions closely. Her people will not go there, they will never find her. But heed this warning. When you cross the rivulet that comes from the mouth of the ice that never melts, you will not be able to return. This is your choice. If you choose to go, you will never see this grove again. Are you ready to accept that?" Stolen hesitated only for a minute. "I accept it," he said. "Tell me how to get to this place." After his mother related how he was to go, Stolen lifted the girl to her feet, took her by the hand, and began to move swiftly through the forest with the dawn behind them. They ran through the grove to the edge of the brook and far up the bank to where it met a river. There Stolen carried the girl across, and they continued on across open land, rising higher and higher toward the tundra, where the trees became stunted and gnarled by wind. They came to the rivulet that flowed from the mouth of the ice. By this time Stolen was carrying the girl, who was exhausted. He did not hesitate to cross the water, his feet aching with the cold as he waited. On the far side he set the girl down in a grove of twisted and gnarled trees, sheltered in the lee of a mountainside and protected by large boulders. It was late afternoon, with the early evening of autumn not far away. He knelt down beside her and looked into her eyes. He had never looked into the eyes of a human being before, but it was not hard for him to interpret what he saw. There was terror there, but also defiance. For the first time Stolen began to consider what the girl must be thinking. She had grown up in a village surrounded by humans and had never seen a Lefala before. To her he must look like an untidy collection of twigs, small branches, and leaves, albeit with the proportions of a man. He began to feel some stirring of regret, and knew he must learn to communicate with her as quickly as possible to allay her fears. The girl raised her chin and gestured to herself. "Rioletta," she said. The word sounded harsh and loud to Stolen, but he understood it to be what she called herself. In his excitement he leaned towards her. "Stolen." The girl drew back and stared at him. In vain Stolen tried to make sounds she might understand, but she turned away. As the sun began to set, the warmth left the land, and he saw that she shivered. She drew her knees up under the garment she wore and curled up against the rock in a small hollow. Stolen moved back and watched her from a few yards away. There would be time to learn her speech in the days to come. Eventually her eyes closed and her breathing slowed. Stolen became aware of movement in the trees, and with a shudder and a shake he was surrounded by Lefala. But Lefala foreign to him. They were not free, they remained rooted in the ground. They leaned toward him, crowding him, prodding him with long, spindly arms. "Why have you come?" one of them hissed. "You bring a human. That is not well." "My mother sent me here to shelter," Stolen said, "to stay where I can live with the one I brought forever." The one nearest him laughed like bark cracking. "Your mother sent you, did she?" he hissed. "And did she tell you that once you have crossed into this domain you can never return?" "I understand that," Stolen said. "Good. Then indeed you will stay with us here, rooted forever. For this is the land of decay, where Lefala come to return to the earth, to dwindle to our roots in the ground. Long will you dwell here, rooted and whipped by the wind, buried by snow in the winter, for you are still young." The Lefala leaned closer to Stolen, and as he laughed, a great gaping hole opened in his bark, and Stolen could smell the sweet, heavy smell of decaying heartwood. "No!" he cried, jumping to his feet. But the Lefala swayed and thrashed, and a heavy glacial wind swept down out of the north. In the morning, Rioletta awakened stiff and cold. She got to her feet and looked around the grove, but there was no sign of the creature of leaves. There were only old, gnarled trees, their roots exposed in the thin soil, wrapped into the cracks in the rocks. Cautiously, she began to walk away from the sheltered hollow. When no one followed, she began to move faster, and then ran across the tundra down along the ice-cold rivulet. She found a narrow spot and leaped across, then looked back, but still there was no one there. Onward she ran, angling down away from the sparkling ice and the crags of high mountains behind and beside her. The turf was spongy beneath her feet, and she looked down and saw that the ground was covered by tiny blue flowers, the color of the autumn sky. After some time she came to the edge of a forest. She felt a sudden presence, and looked swiftly around, fearing the creature of leaves had overtaken her. There was a large wolf standing behind her, and as she peered into the deep woods she saw more. Her heart beat hard. She knew she was small enough to make a meal for a wolf, and she had heard stories of how wolves crept into the villages at night and stole babies. But the wolves made no move toward her, and Rioletta had begun to form her own ideas about who stole children from the villages. Cautiously, Rioletta began to walk again, but the wolves blocked her way. She tried another direction, but they blocked that way too. Finally, she chose a direction the wolves did not block, and then they traveled along around her in a semicircle in the woods. She began to feel she was being escorted rather than threatened. The land began to look familiar, and she came to the bank of a wide river that she recalled. Rioletta found a series of rocks and logs clogging the channel and carefully made her way across. The wolves did not follow, and there she was forced to stop for the night, so she slept curled against a log. In the morning she continued, and every time she was unsure of her way, there seemed to be some bird or animal there to guide her. Finally she arrived at the edge of the grove through which they had passed after leaving her village, and there the very trees seemed to have opened for her, providing a clear path. She ran quickly along it, although she was very tired and hungry, and eventually she arrived at the clearing wherein her village stood. Rioletta was strong, and it took only a short time for her bruised and blistered feet to heal, and for her to feel rested and well. No one believed her story, and her abduction was blamed on the boys of a neighboring village. Everyone thought she would be afraid of the forest. But it was not so. Rioletta often walked along the border of the trees and looked deep into the forest. She began to learn the lore of her people, and was not bothered when the other children whispered that she was becoming a sorcerer. She could hear their whispers, as she could often hear the whispers in the woods. When she heard them, she would stand still and listen for the word, that one whispered word she had heard before.